Hello everyone, we are Group 5. We have chosen question 2 for our essay topic, and our main focus is on crimes committed by protesters during the 2019 protest movement in Hong Kong. Half a year ago, crime seems far away from this very city, which has been crowned as the safest city in the world for decades. However, to date, whenever I turn on the television, Carrie Lam, the chief executive, is repeating her new adopted motto: stop violence and curb disorder. Notwithstanding her hard work, crimes and destructions have not shown any sign of significant regression. Assault, criminal damage, and perhaps even arson has become a visible norm. While protesters may justify their criminal acts by blaming the government's failure in addressing their 5 demands, more and more people are realizing that this is not a satisfactory explanation. The Hong Kong SAR government has been shutting their eyes and tying their hands when facing various demands from the masses for more than 20 years after the handover, and this is the only time when criminal acts become the dominant response. It is unlike Iraq, which is also facing serious riots now, that the masses generally opt for collective violence as a viable means towards the government when their voices are not heard. Yet, the public, as well as the government, are keen to explore the reasons behind criminal acts. It is easy to find different explanations of why protesters commit certain crimes from various sources, including the internet, parents, and even formal responses from the government. Many of these explanations actually resembles different strands of criminological theories. For example, the government's claim that protesters engaged in violent actions due to suffering high economic pressure falls within the ambit of Merton's strain theory, and the claim that governments characterizing protesters as riots lead to more severe deviance is similar to Becker's labeling theory. In this sense, criminological theories seems useful in explaining these crimes. However, we, Group 5, suggest that this seemingly usefulness of theories is actually a distorted reflection of the reality. We defined criminological theories that may provide an explanation to the 2019 movement into two broad categories. The first being general theories of crime, which aims at answering why the individual commits certain crimes that encapsulates most criminological theories, and the second category being the specific criminology of riot developed by Smeltzer that does not look at the individual, but instead explain crimes as collective violence committed by a crowd. We will further investigate these two categories separately and argue that the current framework of criminology may encounter substantial hardship in explaining the 2019 movement. To start with, we would like to outline the scope of crimes we are referring to. From joining an assembly neglecting a letter of objection to burning down a shop with a hail of Molotov cocktail, protesters' range of acts brought about a complicated mixture of crime. While not all criminal acts related to the political unrest equate to violence and disorder, we have observed that the crimes the public and the government demand most explanation are property damage and violent crimes, including wounding and serious assault, arson, rape, and even murder. In light of this, the crimes we investigate limits to criminal damage and violent crimes committed by protesters, excluding the general pool of arrestable offences, and we will not investigate in the possible crimes that may be committed by the police. After drawing the ambit of what crimes we are focusing and the subject we are talking about, we will outline what useful means in the context of criminology and how to ascertain usefulness of a theory. As Sutherland and Cressy put it, criminology has been defined as the study of making laws, breaking laws, and of reacting towards the breaking of the laws. Contrary to hard science, it is generally accepted that criminological theories cannot be determined as inherently true or false. They are not absolute concepts that can transpose into every situation. Rather, the usefulness of criminological theories in a particular real-life scenario hinges on whether the explanation formulated can accurately reflect the relevant events, outline the reason behind it, and cast reasonable predictions. If it cannot receive empirical support or even contradicts to the reality, then we can say this theory is not very useful in explaining the particular event. We will first look at general criminological theories and outline their possible shortcomings. The most evident one is the overemphasis on the individual. According to Clarence R. Jeffrey in the Historical Development of Criminology essay, since the time of Lombroso, the key attention of criminology has been focusing on the individual offender. Most criminological theories, or the so-called general theories of crime we have defined in our analysis, are individual decision-based at a micro level of analysis, which are generally accepted by criminologists as not useful when analyzing macro level of events resulting from several different causes, where the role of individual is minimized. This can be illustrated by the failure of the dominant explanation accepted by the government and the public at the beginning stage of the protest movement, that the protesters are driven by hardship in climbing up the social ladder and the frustration in buying a flat. This argument resembles Merton's strain theory, that the lack of a structured and legitimate means for most people in society to attain material wealth stimulate criminal behavior. This is vividly portrayed by the Financial Times story behind the 2019 Hong Kong political unrest, featuring a person named Derek Liu, a 21-year-old protester claiming that having a good place to live, a stable job, and a decent income were essential to live in Hong Kong. And he said, if you don't have them, you'll find a way to change the society. This leads to an easy conclusion that the crimes are committed out of economic strain. The Extradition Bill was just a trigger, and the motive is to restructure the society. This can be seen in the Chief Executive's policy address released in October this year, where Carol Lam emphasized on subsidizing the lower class and even set $5 billion to provide transitional housing in order to ease their economic burden, for the hope to restore order and peace. However, this argument finds little empirical support, particularly from the demographic perspective. With reference to the total number of arrested protesters until 13th of November, about 40% of them are students, and more than half of the students are receiving tertiary education now, which does not fit the prediction of strain theory. The assumption of the strain theory focuses on lower classes, as they subject to the greatest strain. Conversely, students who do not experience much strain are not strongly correlated. This imbalance is supported demographically. While students currently receiving tertiary education constitute only about 3% of the total population this year, are 20% of arrested protesters being a member of this group is greatly disproportionate, providing an even stronger signal that this wide accepted explanation does not reveal the full picture of the reasons behind the crimes. The inaccuracy of strain theory suggests that even though the general society might have certain presumption on the underlying motives of criminals, there may not be any common intrinsic denominator which distinguishes them from the rest of other law-abiding protesters and even the larger group of the masses. In fact, From the mainstream argument made by protesters, they deliberately blur the line between offenders and non-offenders within the larger group of anti-government activists. They consider themselves participating in a single movement and each playing a different role in a larger compact group. This mentality effectively integrates the various crimes committed by different protesters into an event of collective violence, which is defined by the World Health Organization as the instrumental use of violence by people who identify themselves as members of a group against another set of individuals, in order to achieve political, economic, or social perspectives. With reference to William R. Prout, there is basically no essentialist feature amongst offenders other than their common shared objective and their common belief which form their shared identity, which can hardly suffice as a cause of individual crime under the general scope of criminology. One may counter-argue that the shared identity of protesters does not originate from their political goal, and it is actually not a collective violence. Rather, these protesters as individuals committed criminal acts because the government labeled them as rioters at the beginning of political unrest. This resembles Becker's labeling theory, which suggests that a deviant label imposed by moral entrepreneurs will provoke more deviant behaviors, since it makes it harder for them to continue the normal routines of daily life. This is not entirely true. Although the government had indeed imposed a label on protesters, it does not automatically cause the cycle of self-fulfilling prophecy that leads to the engagement of criminal acts. The cycle requires internalization and acceptance. It is clear that protesters, both offenders and non-offenders, denied such label and have even added the requirement for the government to revoke the characterization in their 5 demands. While such label was rejected entirely by the whole group, it is hard to argue that the loop of Becker is able to run. More importantly, the stigma of the label has little lasting power to inhibit protesters from continuing their daily life routine, and there is always an option to choose alternate lines of action. For example, our protesters, after throwing their Molotov cocktail at a shop, can still go to work tomorrow or go to school the next week, provided that they are not caught. The label attached to them as rioters simply does not have a similar driving force as homosexuality or marijuana suggested by Becker in his book Outsider, that can oust a person into deviant forms of life. From the above analysis, it is clear that theories of criminology tends to subsume different isolated intrinsic features of protesters as the reason of their crimes, based on a presumption that there must be a definite cause shared by these protesters as offenders of criminal law. And therefore, they received little empirical support in accurately describing the reason and development of the movement with reference to their failure to address the collective nature of crimes. And the second shortcoming of general theories of crime in explaining the 2019 movement is the definition of crime itself. According to Sutherland, criminal and non-criminal acts are not very distinct types of behavior. Criminality depends on the status of offender and attitude of the influential part of the public towards this act. He rejected the view that we would have no crime if we have no laws, by suggesting that a behavior will remain essentially the same in a society, regardless of legal status. Under Sutherland's view, stealing will still be stealing even though theft is decriminalized, because the masses will react to it by same public disgrace. This view is taken up by the general criminology scholarship, because if one is attempting to explain motivation and behavior, one cannot rely upon legal categories alone, for the obvious reason that the same behavior pattern will both be legal and illegal at different times and in different places. It is clear that there is an assumption that the public view is rather static towards what to be condemned for this kind of understanding to be true. It is reasonably accurate in a society in a normal setting where cultural shift that alters the masses' view towards an act take place rather slowly, and therefore any changes can be identified easily given the long period of time. However, the situation in Hong Kong in the 2019 protest is out of the ambit of normal setting in the society. Whether a behavior in this period of time is socially acceptable or not rests on the value judgment of the underlying motives of the perpetrator rather than the behavior itself. For example, criminal damage against the MTR and business with ties to the mainland receive acceptance by a large amount of citizens. According to the spokesperson of the Citizens Press Conference, such acts are punishment for the companies that have chosen the wrong side, and he gained support from an online poll with more than 90% of support rate from a pool of 130,000 respondents. While his claim is unlikely to be able to represent the whole general public, it still reveals that a significant proportion of Hong Kongers are actually accepting what behaviors that are generally considered as deviant. Indeed, the highly diversified Hong Kong society makes it almost impossible to identify the influential part of the public. Even if the majority view can be identified, it may not be apt to equate them as the public. This is coupled with the fact that the attitude of the individual during this period of time changes rapidly based on peer pressure, social media rumors, and value-infused portrayals of the press, making a person's view very volatile. That indicates that even if we can identify the majority view, it will lose its significance because that view may not have same amount of support just overnight. In this sense, the concept of the attitude of the public loses its legitimacy to dictate criminality, as its basic assumption that the society and the view of the masses being static does not receive empirical support in the 2019 movement. Now, to briefly summarize the shortcomings of general theories of crime, the over-focus of the individual may not be able to provide a satisfying explanation, as that may be not an essentialist feature among individual criminal actors, and any simplistic generalization of them can hardly obtain empirical support with reference to this period of time. And at the same time, the definition of crimes relying on the society itself and the view of the masses blurs the boundary of the theories and what crime it is looking at when addressing certain actions that are accepted by the masses during this period of time, and this will reduce the strength of explanations that arise from these theories. Now moving away from the category of general theories of crime, we are going to talk about the specific criminology of riot. As mentioned above, the nature of crimes committed by protesters during the 2019 movement can be determined as collective violence. Throughout the development of criminology, it can be classified as three categories. The first is primitive collective violence from one small group towards another small group. The second one is reactive collective violence directed to those in power. And the third one is modern collective violence, which is defined by the increasing number of participants of riots and clearly defined operational goals. And the 2019 movement targets both the government and the groups of pro-government individuals, with a clear goal to achieve the 5 demands. And in this case, it falls into the last category. Based on this classification, Smeltzer developed his theory of collective behavior, which addresses specifically to riot in early 1960s. He claimed that riots arise out of structural instability and tension, which breed a generalized belief that spread among the society. Generalized belief is defined as the short-circuiting, ideological indoctrination that hunts for scapegoats who are made responsibility for the social structural deficiency. Participants in this kind of riots adopt this kind of generalized belief and mobilized by their leaders through agitation and finally engaged in criminal acts in the form of a crowd. On the face of it, the Hong Kong movement resembles the whole process Smelser illustrates. The generalized belief is that the chief executive, Carrie Lam, would chip away Hong Kong's freedom out of central government's orders, while allowing the police to violently suppress citizens without formal restrictions. This belief leads to the scapegoat hunting that focuses on the police as the law enforcer and pro-government or pro-China individuals. Finally, protesters violently attack them or damage their property. It is clear that Smelser's theory refrained from focusing only on the individual. Rather, he views crime from the angle of societal reaction towards certain belief which is sufficient to mobilize a large proportion of the masses. This tackled the aforementioned shortcomings of general theories which fail to ascertain the essentialist feature of offenders other than the common goals and belief, as Smelser breached this generalized belief and protesters through a mixture of collective violence and crowd. However, one key element is missing, which is a leader or a leading figure that can mobilize the whole riot. It is not enough for a person or a group of person that is infused and take up the generalized belief. There is a need for a leader to lead and guide the whole protest and make it into a riot. It is a common understanding that the 2019 Hong Kong movement is unlike any other political movements which has clear leading figures. For example, Wu Kaixi in the 1989 Tiananmen protests. Without leadership in general, can one classify the whole movement as a societal response in the form of collective violence but not individual crimes committed by multiple small leaderless groups? One may suggest that Smelser have not envisaged social media at this time, which is a common tool for protesters to communicate with each other instantaneously. But that introduces another question. Does a leveled communication equate to one-directional control or supervision in a political movement? In fact, since the start of the movement, conflict arising within the larger group of protesters increases and they cannot be resolved easily due to the lack of leadership. And it is clear that there is little empirical data in this area to support or decline that this kind of action can be seen as a single collective act or not. But in fact, the 2019 movement may actually be a useful case study to modify the specific theory of Smelser's if we can finally ascertain that it can suffice as a collective violence. However, in the current stage, it is still unclear that whether this can be classified neatly under Smelser's idea, and therefore, the theory developed by Smelser cannot provide a satisfactory explanation yet. It may need to combine with studies of social media communications and the form of communication between individuals in a larger group to define whether it can suffice as a crowd doing collective violence. And to conclude, our argument is that both categories are not very useful in explaining crimes of some protesters during the 2019 movement. For general theories of crime, the over-focus on the individual often lead to inaccurate generalizations. Rather, they ignored the specific characteristics of a crowd that cannot be found of an individual alone. In addition, the widely accepted definition of crime as a social construct by general criminological theories may backfire in this situation due to the fact that it requires the involvement of value judgment of the masses. On the other hand, the specific criminology of riot is able to address the specific characteristics of a crowd, meaning that they have generally adopted a generalized belief that mobilizes themselves to go out and do crimes in a form of collective violence. However, this model does not envisage the leaderless situations as in the anti-extradition bill saga. Therefore, the current criminological framework encounters substantial hardship in providing a useful explanation of why protesters commit crimes during this movement. Yet, the theory of right of Smelser provide a possible theory, an area of development. By incorporating the technological development and an understanding of the implications on human interactions, leaderless collective violence, similar to the 2019 movements, may be explained under the ambit of criminology in near future after this theory can be modified. Thank you.